We got America in World War II here. You can see the flags of the major belligerents, but obviously there were more countries involved, but this is kind of the major players. So the must-knows for this chapter. One, the Great Migration, right? That's kind of a twofold thing. There's the African American movements during World War I and World War II, but also the people across the country that are helping to mobilize for the war, namely to the south, to the west, and into places like Detroit. You got to know about the Holocaust, the internment of Japanese Americans, island hopping in the Pacific, D-Day, victory in Europe, the use of the atomic bomb, and post-war peace settlements. So, the shock of war. The I think in the last lecture we discussed Pearl Harbor, right, and the shock of America feeling threatened on its own territory is really going to shake America, right? And America's going to kind of question some of its values. And if we think about the ideas of American exceptionalism and what all that stands for, Executive Order 9066 is not going to be something that falls into the category of American exceptionalism. 966 is going to be an order that FDR will sign, which will basically allow for the internment of Japanese, German, and Italian Americans. Now, most of these will be Japanese. It'll be something around 70,000 Japanese people. It's around 11,000 Germans, and I don't have the number for the Italians. But what this did was allow these guys to be basically targeted, rounded up, and put into concentration camps, and it was all under the guise of protecting the homeland. Um, Realized that espionage and all that sort of stuff was something that was a possibility, and people were definitely afraid of it. But even in later years, the government came out and apologized for this. Korematsu versus the U.S. is a direct result of this. In the Order 9066, the government made exclusion zones, and if you were Japanese or German or whatever, and you lived in those zones, you got moved into the internment camps. Korematsu is going to sue the government unsuccessfully. It'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will uphold this under the ideas of national security or whatever. In 2018, Trump versus Hawaii, Chief Justice John Roberts will actually come out and basically say that the court had it wrong and completely repudiate the Korematsu decision. Now, moving on from the sort of civil rights aspect of it, now to the New Deal, it says right there, wiped out. Dr. New Deal traded for Dr. Win the War. So what's going to happen is you're going to get the War Productions Board, and the War Productions Board is going to help to regulate the economy, namely to get it motivated, or not motivated, but mobilized to win the war. And in this, you're going to have basically government involvement in the economy dialed up to 11, right? As I mentioned in class, the New Deal was kind of doing it, right? But this was like, as you can see right down here, it talks about, what is it, 100 billion in military orders just in 1942, right? That's going to be a huge shot in the arm of the economy. And so this is going to create new factories open up. It's going to create new jobs, and it is going to be what drives us out of the Great Depression. So kind of like on the home front here, home front is like the idea that the war has a front, right? Like all quiet on the Western Front, while the home front would be how everybody at home is doing during the war. So the Office of Price Administration is exactly what it says. It's going to be about trying to keep prices low, right? Or keep prices at a stable rate so they don't fluctuate. The National War Labor Board and the Smith-Conley Anti-Strike Act are also going to be kind of like what they sound like. The National War Labor Board is going to work with unions to make sure that basically the workers are taken care of, but there's not going to be much kind of leeway there, as you can see with the Smith-Conley Anti-Strike Act. So if like you were a worker working in a factory that built bombers or something, and you went on strike, that would be like illegal, and they could throw you in jail. That's the big thing there. Waves, WACs, SPARs, all of these are going to be groups for women to participate in the armed forces. I want to say SPARs was the like one of them is the Coast Guard and one of them's the Navy and one of them's the Army and all that sort of stuff. The Bracero program brought migrant workers up from Mexico to work mainly in like agricultural stuff. And then migrations, and part of the idea is the Great Migration, as you can see over here in this map, right? People moved into the South, right? People moved up to Detroit, Houston, Baton Rouge. Actually, that's not recommended, or it's not really represented there in the picture, but it grew significantly. And they also moved out west to California, and all these things. And it doesn't really have it, but they also moved up here. Um, were for war contracts, right? To build tanks and bombers and stuff, ammunition, whatever, right? Um, in this, you're going to get a shifting of people, but you'll notice, right? Where does nobody move? In the very smack dab middle of the country, because they weren't getting those contracts in those places. Now, Congress of Racial Equality, right? As we didn't really mention in class, but the New Deal was not the best for African Americans. There were a lot of loopholes, right, that didn't necessarily extend to African Americans. And we'll see this also when we get to the GI Bill coming back from World War II. And so you see the Congress of Racial Equality, they're trying to represent, the needs of African Americans in the community and in the workplace. Fair Employment Practices Commission also trying to ensure that you get, and we haven't quite segregated the Army yet, but we're about to. But you're starting to see this stuff yet again at home. The rising sun in the Pacific. So last time, right, we talked about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese realized, as it says right here, they were going to have to win quickly or lose slowly. And in that, right, they are going to expand super duper fast. And their hope was is to kind of overrun everybody. So they sweep down, right? We mentioned that they had invaded Manchuria in the 1930s, right, which is up here in, well, I should say up here in northern China. And China is mentioned on the slide. And what happened is during that time period, right, Chiang Kai-shek was resisting the Japanese, and we were aiding them. And Americans basically flew supply drops into China. But what the Japanese did, as you can see, they swept in through the Philippines and the Dutch Indies, and they get all the way here, as you can see, to New Guinea and the coast of Australia. All right. There we go. Now, one of the things that happens is in the Philippines, famously, right, MacArthur is going to defend the Philippines, and they'll retreat back to, I guess it's Bataan, and then MacArthur will have to evacuate, and right, he famously says he will return, and then the guys that are left have to go on the Bataan Death March, where hundreds of them die. What's going to happen, right, is eventually MacArthur will return with a victorious Navy. But what's going to happen here is where it says victory disease. The Japanese had been steamrolling everybody, right, catching everybody off guard, overpowering people, and so they did two things. One, they stretched themselves out too thin. Two, they began to think they couldn't be defeated, right, and that sort of arrogance slash being spread thin is going to be ripe for a counterattack by the Allies. So at the Battle of Coral Sea, the United States will win a huge victory over the Japanese. The battle will take place right here, give or take, and it will be the first naval engagement. Basically between aircraft carriers. So both navies won't actually physically sight each other nor shoot directly upon each other with cannons. It'll all be aircraft. The United States will have the advantage of intercepting Japanese communications and knowing exactly where to be. And this will be a big win. And what will happen is, combine this with Midway, which we'll talk about here in a second. Once the United States basically destroys the majority of the Japanese aircraft carriers due to our industrial might. There was going to be no way for Japan to regain that advantage over us. Um, and so the victory at Coral Sea is going to be the beginning of the end for the Japanese, and Midway will basically let it be known that now the tide is shifting in the Pacific. And as you can see, I mean, just looking at some of these places, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, you can see Wake Island, you can see all these famous names of Marine Corps battles, right, that are just, about to happen, right? So speaking of Midway Island, as you can see up here, is the next major engagement that we'll talk about, and for the navies is another one fought mostly, if not all, excuse me, by aircraft carriers. The hope was is if you took Midway Island, you could um, you could bomb Hawaii, right? And if you bomb Hawaii, you could bomb, take Hawaii, you could bomb the West Coast. Excuse me. So Midway Island up here, right? Another one where we intercept Japanese communiques. We basically plan for their ambush. Um, we destroy 3 of their carriers. They destroy 1 of ours, and this will turn the tide in the Pacific. Now, leapfrogging or island hopping is a pretty ingenious idea here, right? Instead of engaging the enemy where they were strong, the United States made the concerted effort to skip or hop those islands or leapfrog those islands to islands that were less defended. Um, and so this is why we get the battles of Tarawa, Wake Island, Iwo Jima. Not really Okinawa. We needed Okinawa, but um, these battles, right, where the Japanese fought tooth and nail to the last man and would rather, um, commit suicide than be captured, really are going to set the tone for the fights in the Pacific and are part of the lore of the Marine Corps. And um, are very harrowing, and I recommend anybody read about them, or if you have time, go watch HBO's The Pacific, or even if you want, go play Call of Duty World at War. A lot of it takes place on some of these islands. All right, so now we're going to move on to the European theater here. The title, as you can see, says The Allied Halting of Hitler. What we're going to start with here are the wolf packs, right, of the German High Command here. So the little ships, right, on the map, they represent, as it said right here, 10 Allied merchant ships sunk by U-boats. So you can see from the map that there's a ton of U-boats sinking Allied shipping. And in doing that, right, this is going to call for convoys and eventually the use of aircraft. That's going to be a big game changer in the fight against the German U-boat. And remember, this is one of the things that drug us into the First World War. This is a major strategy of the Germans, and really, they're going to be able to sail and fight all over the Atlantic, but they're basically just going to quarantine in a big part around the UK to stop all this stuff going to them for the war effort. So the U-boat, right, which is pretty easy to vilify, right? It doesn't seem very honorable at times, but it was a crafty way to wage war. Also, the U-boats were pretty advanced for the time, but there were high casualty rates on these ships. Because if anything goes wrong on a submarine, it could be fatal. Now, to fight the Nazis early in the war, we're going to see the use of American air power. So what's going to happen is U.S. bombers are going to be stationed in the United Kingdom. In particular, my grandfather, who served as a B-17 ball turret gunner, was stationed down here at Great Ashfield. And for my generation, World War II was all the grandparents' war kind of thing. And so both my grandfathers served in World War II, but my uncle Barney, my grandfather, Barney Blackwell, served as a B-17 ball turret gunner and flew missions over let's see here, Bremen, Kiel, Edmund, Munster, Schweinfurt, Paris, and kind of the most famous one he would have been on was to well, Wilhelmshaven, the heavy water plant in Norway up here, right, which was where the Germans were trying to produce heavy water, which was a way back, they thought, in the 1940s to produce a nuclear bomb. Um, but back to the original point here is these guys bombed around the clock out of the United Kingdom. Um, the British, with lesser resources, would fly at night, and the Americans would fly during the day. And they would fly in big groups, with bombers being escorted by planes. By flying during the day, this made them huge targets. I don't have the stats, and I'll have to find them, but being in the U.S., I guess in the moment, the time it was the U.S. Army Air Corps, was actually the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous jobs you could have in World War II. We often think about the Marines and the beaches and all the stuff they did there. It was great. But really, the fatality rate of being in the air crews was greater, I believe, than those other ones. And so the German wolf packs, the round the clock bombing, right? This is all pre ground war going. So we were fighting in the Pacific, right? And we're also then starting to fight in Europe, but not necessarily on the ground. Now, getting back to it down here, the next thing we got is North Africa. So in North Africa, right, this is going to be Operation Torch. Um, namely, the Germans and the Italians, I should say, began to take over North Africa. The United States is going to help Britain because they're worried about the Suez Canal falling into the hands of the Nazis, and then that would cause a shortage of oil to the continent. And this is also going to be the first engagement for U.S. ground troops, and it's going to be a big eye-opening event. You're going to have the Battle of Kasserine Pass, which the Germans are going to hand it to the United States, and eventually we get other famous battles like the Battle of El Alamein. What this will do, though, is this will drive eventually the Nazis from North Africa, and their famous commander, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, right? He was a skilled commander, is going to eventually have to be forced back onto mainland Europe. And what this will give is the Allies a foothold, which I guess I'll come back up here to this map if we think about North Africa, right? Which eventually is going to lead to Italy. Um, in Italy, in Salerno, you're going to have paratroop drops, more amphibious assaults, and eventually working your way up the boot of Italy. Famously, in the Italian campaign, you'll get Field Marshal Montgomery and Patton's rivalry will get going, and they'll both be like racing to Rome to like liberate the country. And Patton will hit one of his soldiers, right, and that'll get him put on suspension basically. Speaking of Patton, we got D-Day coming up here, June 6, 1944, aka Operation Overlord. What they're gonna do is amass all their troops down here in the southern part of the United Kingdom. And while they're doing that, they're actually going to make a fake army right roughly where Great Ashfield was. They're going to make a fake blow-up army that they will not mistakenly, they will let the Germans think is going to be controlled by Patton, right? Patton had made a big name for himself in the earlier conflict, and they put Patton in charge of this fake army as, yet again, his suspension. And the Germans are actually going to move divisions up here, right, to block what they think is going to be a landing at Calais. Calais is right next to Dunkirk, if you want context of earlier in the war. Now, with this, right, will eventually be the D-Day landings here, right, in Normandy and not at Calais. The largest ever amphibious assault on that day. Dwight Eisenhower sent them a letter that goes like this. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms, on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine and the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year, 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle. Man to man, our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons, munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, something to make note of there is it talks about the ideas of the United Nations. That has nothing to do with the UN. What that is kind of like name for the Allies. But that whole letter, right, you can file that under American exceptionalism, right? We're freedom-loving peoples fighting for a free world, right? All that good stuff. So with the D-Day invasion, the United States will begin the war in earnest, like in fighting on the ground. Now, besides the troops landing in the water, you're going to have the Navy bombarding the beach. You're going to have, the airborne troops landed behind the lines, and read about D-Day. It's great. Now, after the victories on the beaches there, they're going to begin to push inland, and it's going to look like it's going to be wrapped up quickly. A couple of kind of famous engagement here. Operation Market Garden is going to be a failed airborne attempt. Montgomery is going to have this idea that they're going to use an armor column coming up. I forget what thoroughfare it is, but it crosses several bridges. And the hope was is that they would be able to use airborne troops to capture those bridges as the armored columns came up to meet them. And with that, hopefully keep the Nazis from blowing those bridges up. Unfortunately, this is famously where the term "a bridge too far" comes from, because the last bridge they won't be able to get. Now, the Germans will have a counteroffensive, and in that counteroffensive, you will have the Battle of the Bulge. What's going to happen, and this isn't really like to scale or anything, but like right up here, the German line is going to bulge like this in trying to get back into France. And Bastogne is going to be like right there. I mean, yet again, that's not on the map correct, but that's the bulge. The 101st Airborne will be surrounded, and they will hold out for Patton to come relieve them. Famously, while they're surrounded, the Germans will send a letter of truce to the 101st and say, hey, if you guys surrender, we'll let you live, blah, blah, blah. And General McAuliffe, the commander of the 101st, responded one word: nuts. And he was renowned for not using profanity, and that was kind of his way of saying go to hell, right? Eventually, the weather will clear, the Air Force will drop supplies, Patton's column will make it, the German advance will run out of gas, and it's really going to be spell the end of time for the Germans. As the Allies rush to Berlin, Hitler in a bunker will eventually commit suicide. And then with the taking of Berlin and the end of actions in Europe, you will get VE Day, which is the unconditional surrender of the Nazis on May 8th or 9th, depending on when it was, 1945. All right, I'm going to go through this quickly so we can finish up here. Bomber attacks. We're back out in the Pacific. The United States is trying to bring the Japanese to surrender, but as we know, culturally, that's not going to be part of what they do. And so they begin to attack civilian populations in Japan because they realize that was going to be the only way. They begin to firebomb civilian populations in Tokyo, in particular. In this one, you can see in the picture here, they would use incendiary bombs, and most of Japan at the time was wooden, and they basically lit huge chunks of territory on fire. Reports of people jumping in the river to stave off the thing, but being cooked alive. They would take to do this. They had to take the island of Okinawa, get a big Marine Corps victory, and then they would bomb around the clock on the Japanese mainland. The Potsdam Conference. At the Potsdam Conference was basically the discussion of like what to do after the war was over. This will actually be a part of several conferences. You'll famously have the Yalta Conference. There's the Casablanca Conference and a Tehran Conference where these guys would meet, and they made the decisions like, okay, Europe is the most important thing first, right? I think they do that at Yalta. The Potsdam Conference, they were discussing the post-war kind of situation. and what were they going to do, right? They always have the famous leaders here. So you have Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. Usually you had FDR, but he passed away. You'll read about that in the textbook. I didn't get into that. Also, we'll talk about these conferences also in the next chapter because they play a big role in the post, war aftermath and how did Germany get divided up. One of the things that's not mentioned though at the Potsdam Conference to Stalin in particular, because Harry Truman didn't trust him, was the creation of atomic bombs. Our man Churchill knew. We told him. The Manhattan Project, which is the atomic bomb project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, led up by Dr. Oppenheimer, designed and created 2 atomic bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy. Um, uh, by today's standards, these are relatively small atomic devices, but at the time they were cutting edge, and they were used to bring the war to an end. First on Hiroshima, and then secondly on Nagasaki. Both places would have been warned with pamphlets. Truman basically gave them an ultimatum to surrender, and they didn't. He drops the first bomb. They had actually had a different target on the second bombing instead of Nagasaki. I don't remember what it is, but you can look it up. The weather wasn't good for it, so they had to move to their secondary target, which was Nagasaki, and they dropped the bomb there as well. This will bring the unconditional surrender of Japan, and that will set us up for the 1950s and sort of like America's heyday. Now, might add some videos back to this just so it can have a little bit more entertainment value for you. But you don't have to watch those if you don't want to watch them. Hope everything's going well, guys. Talk to you soon.